We're live.
Good evening and welcome to the New Athens. You need to emerge from this COVID 1984 pandemic with the tools to create a new world. The New Athens, the blockchain think tank, brings you those tools to understand the chaos swirling around us and the forum to debate how a new generation will take control from the GoVidiots currently mismanaging our nation and our world with a breakaway civilization leaving us behind. Watch our Friday Night Lights live stream from the bunker on the New Athens YouTube channel for the best that is thought and said on the issues of the day. Ask not what the New Athens can do for you. Ask what you can do for the New Athens. If you like it, leave a like. If you like the content, please subscribe and share. I'm Laurenzo Mefsud, founder of the New Athens. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.
Hello, and welcome to the New Athens live 2023 season 2 premiere. This is episode 38, and we're going live on the evening of Monday, January the 23rd, 2023, or so they say. And we're here live from the bunker with a live think tank session, and we're joined tonight by Pablo George-Nascimento, publisher of Editorial Nascimento, an Anglo-Chilean publishing house, who is a really fascinating figure, building great technology, building great structures for freedom, and announcing a new collaboration between the New Athens and Editorial Nascimento of Smart Cities Conference series called the Tertulias. Pablo, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure as always, Laurenzo. As you know, whenever I sit down with you, I always get the sensation that I need to put on my seatbelt, even though I'm not moving anywhere.
Well, you know what the Book of John said, let another mouth praise you. Thank you.
Yes, I'll be sitting here waiting for your return here. I do. Let's just pat each other on the back.
That's Oliver on the controls. Say hello to Mornington Media, our host here in the bunker. So Pablo, where shall we start? So you're in the process of reviving your 150-year-old publishing house, Anglo-Chilean publishing house, Editorial Nascimento.
Correct.
Tell us a little about it first, and then we'll go into some more details about the new project.
Well, Nascimento, the Nascimento publishing house has its roots. Its real roots are in the middle of the Atlantic, in the island of Corvo, the smallest and most westerly and the most remote point of Europe, of the Azorian archipelago. And my great grandfather was born and bred there, and a family that has been there for hundreds of years. He dreamt of getting away from the island. His father was a whaler who in the mid-1800s worked with Herman Melville before he published Moby Dick.
Really?
And so this stuck with him forever. And books, of course, they were the only means of escape. He didn't have a PlayStation, unfortunately. It was the 1800s after all. And he read and read and read, and his brother, there were 11 siblings. He was the youngest. The next youngest was a priest who would often bring books back, and he built a big bookshelf, a big shelf full of books, both in Portuguese and English, actually, and Spanish. And his father, the whaler, would spend a year at a time away from home and would often come back with books. And one of the books he brought back was Moby Dick, one of the first editions in English. Now, little did my great-grandfather know where it would all end up. And I think what he managed to achieve was so far beyond his wildest expectations, but it was driven out of his love of books. And he undertook a long journey to Chile because he had an uncle, his mother's brother, had moved from the Azores down to Santiago, had opened up the Libreria Nascimento in 1873. He had started publishing books. That was a typical model, especially in Latin America. If you wanted to get your book published, it was generally a bookstore owner that would do the publishing for you.
So like an impresario.
It was a bit of an impresario. That's the closest you got to getting some form of publisher doing the whole publishing process on your behalf. Or the other option, of course, was vanity publishing, which just meant you got your own manuscript, would go to a printing factory and get 500 copies for X amount of pesos. So what happened with my great-grandfather is he dreamt, he didn't want to be a whaler, didn't want to be a priest like his brother, didn't want to be a farmer like the other people, the other men that stayed on the island. He'd fallen in love with books, and he knew he had an uncle on the other side of the world in this strange country, in this very far away land called South America, and that's where he was going to go. And he decided that pretty early on. So he was quite a prodigy in terms of literature and literacy, and by the age of 10, 11, 12, he was already helping the priest with literacy lessons for adults on the island. And when he reached the age of 19, he said, I know, I'm going to do exactly what my other siblings did. I'm going to move out of this place because there's nothing to do in the middle of the Atlantic. I need to go somewhere exciting, and I am going to go down to this country, Chile, to go and work with my uncle, who I don't know. I'll stop off in the United States to say hello to all the brothers that I have never met in my life. So at age 19, he made the grand announcement, told his mother and his father, who had just returned from a whaling sortie, I'm off. I'm going to Chile via the United States, where all my brothers live in San Francisco. And so he did. He took a boat, a whaling boat, as arranged by his father, from Horta, one of the bigger islands, cut across to New Bedford. Funnily enough, that's where Moby Dick starts.
Oh, really?
That's where Ismail is arriving in New Bedford, because it's the whaling hub of the United States.
Oh, I see.
It's New Bedford and the little island just across the other side under Cape Cod, which is Nantucket.
Yes.
So he arrived. His priest brother had already settled in New Bedford, had become the parishioner of the Portuguese whalers. He stayed with his brother for a couple of months, then took the Horse of Fire, aka train, from Boston, cut across the United States on a trip that took a week across the northern Shoshone, Cheyenne territory. It really was still the far west. Yes. This is only recently that we could say that it's no longer the far west. And arrived in San Francisco. Halfway through 1905.
Oh, really? Oh, when it was going up in smoke?
Well,
shortly, yes.
Yeah, not yet. I mean, he was, and his brothers took him in. They already had a hotel there.
Yes.
They had opened up, incidentally, it was the Lawrence Hotel.
Ah.
Because, as you know,
Laurenzo.
Yes. is a big name in my family. It's one of our surnames. So they invited him to stay there. They wanted him to stay there. What are you going to go down to this faraway southerly latitude for? You know, who do you know down there? Just stay here. But no, the dream was just way too strong. He said he was leaving a few months later, and he got on a boat, traveled the entire length of the Western American coastline. So all the way from San Francisco down to Valparaiso. Valparaiso back then was, before the Panama Canal was completed, was the largest port of the South Pacific. Now on this trip, his cabin companion stole all of his gold coins given to him by his father in order to survive the trip. And as if that wasn't enough, when he finally arrived in Valparaiso and got off the boat, two thieves made off with his two suitcases, which meant he practically arrived in Chile with nothing.
Penniless.
One hand in front and another one behind. Fortunately, the Portuguese consul general saved the day by giving him the last couple of pesos so that he could get the train from Valparaiso and do the 100-mile journey to Santiago, where he would at last, after 10 years of dreaming, he would at last be with his uncle in and at the Libreria Nascimento, and his literary dream would begin. And that's exactly what he did. He got on the train, finally arrived in Santiago, and before you know it, he's standing outside this place he's always been dreaming of since he's a kid. And he's reading Libreria Nascimento, and he's about to meet this uncle of his. And that's what he does. He goes in through the door, spots the uncle. He could recognize the family member quite easily.
I think we can actually illustrate it, Oliver. I'm trying to find it now. But go on, Pablo.
And he walks through the door and announces himself to the uncle. Says, "Hey, uncle, it's me, Manuel Carlos George-Nascimento." And his uncle looks at him after 20,000 kilometers of traveling and God knows how many months and 10 years of dreaming, and says, "Well, we don't need anybody here. Thank you very much. Thanks for popping by. And here's 2 pesos. Go and buy yourself an ice cream." So you can imagine how this entire dream came crashing down on him, aged 19. And I'm still surprised that he managed to live through this. You know, he had no way of calling back home on Skype or WhatsApp or whatnot, you know, to announce that the uncle had been a right weirdo, not giving him any sort of a refuge. But his mother had told him. His mother told him that that the uncle was a bit strange sometimes. He had mood swings, and that in case he did have a mood swing, to please get on a train and head down to another city, not Santiago, the city of Concepcion. And she said, "Look, if your uncle starts playing up, head to Concepcion. There's 2 Portuguese families from our island. They'll take you in." That's what he did. Next day, he's on a train heading down 600 miles to the city of Concepcion. And yes, the 2 Portuguese families that he manages to find, and who have by then already opened up a pawnbroking activity, they take him in. They open their doors. They give him a place to stay and even a job at the pawnbrokers. And he moves in with them in the beginning. 3 days after he's arrived, he's out and about wandering around Concepcion when he bumps into this young lady that he very much takes a liking to. And that's my great-grandmother.
Ah, exactly.
Yes, just 3 days after he arrives in Concepcion. And he didn't speak much Spanish, but he does manage to make himself understood. And they eventually, well, my great-grandmother was a member of the Sociedad de la Ilustración de la Mujer, the Ladies' Illustration Society. It was a cultural group of young women who loved reading and culture and art, etc. So they fall in love because, of course, his favorite activity is reading. Her favorite activity is reading. Must have been cheaper just to share a bookshelf, I guess. I don't know. And they get married. And he graduates as an accountant. And finally, they settle down. And he lives there 12 years. After 12 years, a telegram arrives from Santiago. And it says, Mr. Nascimento, your uncle has died. Please come up to Santiago to liquidate this bookstore that your uncle has left. And that's what he does. He gets on a train. He heads back up to Santiago, straight through the door from which he had been
so roundly rejected.
Despised
of men.
Yes. And he walks through, opens up the books, and realizes that the accounting was pretty good. The numbers were very nice. And he remembered that that's what he had gone to Chile for. So he decides to keep the bookshop. And that's when the dream starts.
Ah.
You see? So that was the year 1917.
Oh, okay.
Which is a very historically loaded year.
Yes. I mean, we were only last night producing a documentary, which will be premiering soon. We were focusing on the history of 1917 in Odessa, on the other side of the world, another one of your favored cities, which was trying to make a bid for freedom at that time from the Ukraine, and federated itself as a free port city to the Soviet Union as it was forming. And it was then invaded by Ukraine, by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on. So it's a really astonishing year all across the planet. So this is when Nascimento falls into the hands of your great grandfather, who then builds it up as a kind of national brand.
Well, I mean, that's what I thought. You see, that's why this entire publishing journey has turned out to be so incredible for me, because my initial impression really was that it was a national phenomenon. And as I began researching it, I became aware that it was actually a lot more widely known than I had anticipated. In fact, my moment of epiphany was actually here in the UK, not even in Chile, when I came across some key people in the publishing sectors who knew my great-grandfather. Of course, it's not difficult if you're the publisher of Pablo Neruda and Gabrielle Mistral and Nicanor Parra and practically the whole who's who of the 20th century of Latin American literature and beyond, to be known. So that's where it really became so interesting for me, because I realized that this research and this family, this past of mine that I didn't know very much about, began to reveal lots of aspects about me that I could immediately recognize. I hadn't realized I had inherited so much from these people. And whether that's subconsciously, whether I heard it when I was 6 months old and I can remember the history, or whether it's epigenetics, I don't know, but I do read the stories of this family and I think, I know that.
You said you'd seen Nascimento books far afield?
Everywhere, not least in the British Library.
Yes.
So the British Library has hundreds of, if not thousands of Nascimentos. So that was another funny story that I found out in Chile, that my great-grandfather once a month would pack off boxes of his latest books to the world's biggest libraries. And that was the British Museum Library
at the time, in the reading room, yes, where Marx wrote the Capital and the Communist Manifesto, which is now kind of like an exhibition space. But at the time was a copyright library. And copyright libraries are very interesting, and they form this kind of lattice work of, as you say, sort of decentralized databases of knowledge. And because of copyright libraries and ancient libraries as well, we've got this network of printed books around the world and archives of newsprint and so on, printed materials certainly, and that really forms the first and grounding stage in the distribution of knowledge and in the preservation of knowledge against deletion. And certainly we'll be looking in a little bit about at how the deletion of knowledge and the deletion of information has become so important in our age. But on that note, how did the publishing house come to form part of the national story?
Well, when my great-grandfather decides to take this bookshop, which, by the way, was already publishing writers, as I explained in the previous, how the Latin American or even world publishing model worked. He arrives at a time where Chile had spent most of the 19th century building its image through the arts, through culture. You have to remember that the American countries are nowhere near as old as the European ones. We are Europeans, arrived in the Americas, and we are relating ourselves to this new land, but we don't have the link that our grandparents had with, I don't know, his manor in La Manta, or with his villa out in, I don't know, Toscana or something like this.
Oh, hidalgos. Explain to the audience hidalgos. You told me this and I was amazed. What does it mean? What does hidalgos mean? It's a term that we've heard.
Hidalgo comes from hijo de algo, and the H's used to be F's. So it was filho de algo, son of something or son of someone.
And so this is part of the sort of Wild West of the new world, you were saying.
I mean, it was the main motivator that sort of kept the young Europeans coming to enrich themselves, then take the loot back to Spain, and with all the gold that they had managed to get their hands on, they would buy nobility titles in order to go from labradores, labor, labrador, worker of the land in general, to having a title, being someone, and being able to very royally do nothing at all.
And produce sons of someone, hidalgos.
And produce sons of someone, you know, as you probably know already. You know, you had, the point back then was to have very long nails to show that you didn't work the land.
Yes.
And you had those big frilly, you know,
ruffs, yes,
you know, all lovely and white to show that you didn't get dirty because you didn't have to do any work.
Yes.
So I guess it was another way of getting these poor souls to bring over the gold, hand it to the kings, and they would get a little title that they could say
wear it on their chest.
Yes. So that was the hijo de algo, hidalgo. And that was one of the main drivers for which the young Spaniards and even Europeans would actually join ranks in the Spanish army or navy and head out to the new world. But this is important, you know. It's what I was saying to you about our sense of identity, because Latin Americans, actually Americans in general, that'll include North Americans as well. We've had to invent our identity out of nowhere.
Yes.
We've invented our identity. Actually, we haven't even invented it. We've constructed it on the back of culture.
Yes.
And so the 19th century in Chile was very much dedicated to this identity. And we came into the 20th century in a situation where there were a lot of incredible poets in the making. And my great-grandfather happens to be in the right place at the right time with the right idea, because he opens up what is effectively the first modern publishing house in Latin America. What's the difference between that and what had happened before? Before, it was a bookstore owner who would make the book, and but there wasn't any sort of notion of curation. A publisher is so much more than someone who just bungs some text together, prints it out on a piece of paper.
So it's a collaboration rather than a print to order manufacturing.
It's much more than a collaboration. It's actually artwork. It's curation.
Yes.
It's a selection of typography, how you set the design of the book, the type of paper you use, whether you number the pages, whether you put an index in the book, what size you make it. This is one of the big phenomena that happens with the Aldine Press. The Aldine Press is the first publishing house on earth in Venice, 1495.
Yes.
The discovery, quote unquote, discovery of America is 1492.
Yes.
So you realize that the publishing world has been around roughly the same in parallel with the discovery of the New World. There is a straight, direct correlation there.
Which is new technology at that time. So we have the Gutenberg invention of the printing press. Then we have the industry building up around it. And at that time, that's the new technological platform that the New World can use to disseminate its identity.
And what's even...
craft that identity.
And it is a craft. Now, what is really, really incredible and super interesting is that the place where all of that happens is Venice. Venice is a city that is against the Spanish.
Yes.
They only, as you and me have spoken about before, they only ever really come together eventually for the Battle of Lepanto.
Yes.
And that's when they reconcile themselves. Up until then, the Venetians hated the Spaniards. And anything that Spain did, the Venetians did the opposite. So if the Spaniards were dressing their women up to their, all the way up to their necks, the Venetians were giving them, nice cleavages and, bringing out the shapes and in the dresses and the art, etc. So what happened in Venice was, of course, in order to make a publishing house and to make it work, you need a place where people know how to write, but fundamentally to read.
Yes.
And there needs to be money.
Yes.
What better place in Europe than the leading merchant city of the continent, Venice? They were merchants. They knew how to read. They knew how to write. They had a lot of money. They had a lot of patrons interested in books. And along comes a young Italian man from the area of Latina called Aldo Manuzio and puts together the Aldine Press in 1495. And what does Aldo Manuzio do? Aldo doesn't just select the paper and the typography and the fonts, etc. But what he also invents in books is numbering the pages. He puts indexes into the books. And the most important thing he does is to reduce the size of those enormous books written by priests with beautiful artwork, etc. And he invents the pocket-sized books. Therefore, reading for pleasure. A book that you can carry with you and you can lounge under a tree on a spring or summer's day and read.
Miniaturization so there's another technology for us. So we're building these technological layers now, and looking at how they stack.
And mass production of books.
Yes,
of course. Yes. So when I saw that, of course, and as a kid, I lived in Italy, as you know. I grew up in Rome for a couple of years, between 6 and 8. playing inside the Colosseum. I used to live on Via dei Serpenti with Via Panisperna, which is literally 250 meters from the wall of the Colosseum. My school, Principessa Yolanda, was inside the Forum. I mean, literally
In the Forum.
inside the Trajan Foro Traiano, the Trajan Market.
Forum, yes.
So I grew up running around there. So you can imagine I was always very much influenced by all things Italian. I was very much impressed by the history. As a young kid from the Americas, I don't think I'd ever seen a house older than 50 years because for us, everything is new. We don't have that concept of old. The oldest house that we've ever built must be 300 years old.
Yes.
The house I live in London is 160 years old. So you can imagine, the sort of perception of this young Latin American kid who comes across to the other side of the world and suddenly is surrounded by people of different colors and mixes of races. I'd never seen a black person in my life. I'd never seen an Indian person in my life. So my first impact with London when I arrive is I get off at Victoria Station, and I get off of the train. I say, "Mom, look at that lady with a bed sheet on." And my mom says, "No, Pablito, that's a lady from India, and she's wearing a dress called a sari." A sari, okay, the sari, and that's an Indian lady, okay. Surely enough, a week later, I'm at school. I don't speak a word of English. I walk into the toilet. There's the school bully, and we have a fight, and I beat him up. So a week later, me and the school bully, Mark, are best friends, even though we can't understand what the other's saying. And I take him home, and I say, "Mum, this is the Indian kid that I beat up last week." And she takes me to one side, and she says, "He's not Indian. He's mulatto." So mulatto goes, "Yes, his dad is African from Nigeria and his mother's English." Oh, okay, right. So this entire new world opened up before me. I didn't know, and to a certain degree with this Nascimento story, I sort of feel like that again. I feel like that again, only it's more intimate, of course, because I look back into the history of this family, 500 years of seafaring family from the middle of the Atlantic, and of course I can almost feel this melancholy, this continuous sense of saudade. Saudade in Portuguese is longing.
Yes.
And I've
like
always
Heimweh. The Germans have a word for it. The English don't really.
No, I don't know.
The
No,
longing
I don't
for
think
home.
So.
No, I don't think there's. I think there's a single word that describes it.
Yeah.
But the Germans and the Portuguese do.
The Portuguese build an entire culture of saudade.
Yes.
I mean, all of the music.
Fado.
The fado is acoustic saudade.
Yes.
Right. And so, my great grandfather arrives as a young Portuguese man with a lot of saudade to live his dream. But and he arrives at the right time. By 1917, he's finally decided to take. This is going back, of course, to your first question. He decides to keep the bookshop. He brings a couple of collaborators on side, 2 writers. One is Cesar Cascabel, who makes 6 books with him in the beginning. And the other is a young writer called Eduardo Barrios. And now Eduardo Barrios is key to this entire story because he's the man who knows all of these young poets and young writers. So he's the man that's, giving my great-grandfather advice, saying him. And one of the people that he sends to my great-grandfather is a young man called Ricardo Neftali Reyes Basualto. aka Pablo Neruda.
Ah,
He's the one that sends Pablo Neruda to my great-grandfather. And so in 1923, this young, tall, young, pale man, as Barrios described him, he said, a tall, pale, young man is going to come and see you. Pay attention, he's going to be a great writer. And in through the door walks Pablo Neruda. And my great-grandfather, of course, takes him on immediately. Next year, of course, obviously 1924 will be the 100th year since he published his most famous book, The 20 Love Poems and a Song of Despair, which is the best-selling poetry book in the history of the Spanish language by quite some margin.
yes.
And so as I investigated all of this, I began lifting the lid on the different stories that my great-grandfather had written just in his day-to-day life, which were just breathtaking. And I came to the conclusion that I couldn't possibly let that die out. So here I am, 105 years later,
Yes.
making sure that this thing takes off. And one of the other things he did is, to finish answering your question, is in 1930 he opened up the first floor of his Central Santiago bookshop, opened it up to writers and poets, and let them come in, even on a daily basis, at midday for their roundtable meetings called Tertulias.
A live think tank, such as the one we're now building
Correct.
here in London.
Yes. And that's what a tertulia is in Spanish. Yeah, it's a meeting.
Like a salon, like a literary salon, but also political.
It's political. I mean, famously, the poets and the writers would get together there, as per many descriptions, not just to talk about literature. They'd get together there to argue, to have fights, to hate each other. And then, of course, all the other positive projects would be born there. New talent would come in and be discovered by my great-grandfather. Collaborative projects would be set up. You can't beat the face-to-face.
Yes.
You can't beat the face-to-face. You
No,
can hate
absolutely.
someone, from afar, but you meet them face-to-face, you think, wow, there's something fascinating. I don't have to like that person, but there's something fascinating about them.
Yeah, we've been experiencing that a lot recently with censorship. We've been looking at uncensorable video platforms in terms of the technology of it, and what we're seeing today, which perhaps was something that the culture of that time in that place did tolerate, is an intolerance of diversity of opinion, and a shrillness in trying to silence those with opinions other than one's own by certain political movements. And so really what we're looking at is to revive that tradition of spirited debate. And so that needs a little bit of curation in terms of providing the forms in which that debate can occur. But certainly it's something that we're desperately in need of today. We were in touch only last week with various YouTube platforms, in fact, who were very concerned that they might be cancelled, that they might lose their archives of videos due to a single slip up in terms of censored video platforms and the community guidelines they enforce over content in videos. And so now we're experiencing this kind of crunch time for free speech. And what we found coming into contact with podcasters was that they often store their data inside their YouTube channel drafts folder. I know you do this. I noticed this with the Nascimento YouTube channel, and actually doing an analysis of the server space that various podcasting studios have locally. They often don't store their data on a server rack on hard drives inside their office space, studio space. Now, this is a massive problem if, let's say, you produced a 6-hour series of documentaries on Byzantine history, but then which is a finished document, but then there's many more hours that have gone on the cutting room floor. There are many more hours of footage there. There's an archive of work. But then in another track of your broadcasting and publishing, you put together, let's say, a controversial podcast on whether men can be women. And that is considered to be out of bounds by your platform provider. And then your whole channel gets locked and deleted away from you. Even so, even that work that's nothing to do with politics. Now this is what we've been discovering as a major threat to the publishing online of content today. And so what that led us to consider was these orthogonal tracks, the different layers of the preservation of information, both publishing physical copies of books, because that's a form of decentralization, as you say, in copyright libraries around the world, which means that if one goes up in a fire, the others still remain. Now we're seeing such a centralization of information digitally that something like what Nascimento is doing makes a lot of sense, because the internet has become a series of walled gardens. It's funny that we don't remember past ages, even though they're very recent. I mean, what John Betjeman said, that the most hated time is the recent past. And there's a recent past of a free internet of information. We were in a position in the 90s, the noughties, where people created websites using the TCP/IP protocol, which was freely distributed. And those websites would, unless you didn't pay your subscription to your ISP, your internet service provider, or you kept your hosting going, that those would be your domain to publish what it is that you wanted to publish. Now we've come through a filter of major social media platforms, which then curate content into a page within their walled garden, which they then can control the content of with terms of service, with community guidelines, as they call them on YouTube and other platforms now, and hence regain control. There was a consolidation and a regaining control of the Wild West of the internet, and we've heard a lot about different Wild Wests so far, and we're kind of in one right now. So let's understand more about Tertulias, and then how they will have an impact today.
I think the point about the Tertulias nowadays is, I mean, has a lot of similarities to what used to go on in the past at my great-grandfather's Central Santiago bookshop. One thing I would add, certainly for non-Latin Americans, is that Latin America has always been, if you like, a hotbed for incredible ideas, precisely because we have not been tied down by a heritage of thousands of years of history. Because Latin American identity has been built on the back of the great imagination and almost, if you like, artificial creation, fast, express creation of culture, almost a desperation to find an identity that we didn't possess. That's really what it's down to. We are we are a continent without an identity in many respects, because we're all descended from somewhere else.
Yes.
That's the truth. So a lot of our culture, a lot of our songs and our music speak of the land where I was born, and this and that, and it's all it's beautiful, it's romantic, but it does show an urgency to have some closer link, a more intimate, longer lasting, or more historically valid link to a piece of land that we've only recently been in. So that's really what the Tertulias, and not just the Tertulias. The Tertulias were I think, a sort of springboard for book projects to happen. So that answers one part of your question. What were the Tertulias for? I think my great granddad facilitated that space.
So it's a form of peer review.
Not just review. It really was through that. He brought in so much young talent. He inspired young men to become writers, to become poets. And in the Central Santiago bookstore, young men at a time where poetry in Chile was at an all-time high in terms of quality, because Chile is very often referred to as the land of poets. Well, that really was the heyday. You're talking about the heyday of Chilean poetry, going from the 20s through to the perhaps the 70s, and until Pinochet arrived.
Yes.
And with that culture came sort of a crashing down because it was silenced.
Yes.
Again, what we're talking about, trying to silence anyone with an alternative way of viewing things, of thinking, etc.
Yeah, we associate silencing with fascism, of people like Pinochet. Now it seems that intent is coming from a wing of politics that we never thought would have that in it. I mean, if you look at the protests of the 60s, the free speech wing was what at the time was the old left. And so now we're seeing this kind of shift,
reversal of roles is very strange,
of left and right or so-called claimed left, so-called claimed right in politics. And we've been talking about how we move beyond left and right, which we'll get onto later. But no, so tell us a little bit about the Pinochet time, because that was the reason for your coming to London. Is that right?
Yes. Well, my parents split when I was 3 years old. My father comes from mostly a center-right family, a family who had arrived in Chile from Argentina, because my grandfather, who was Polish, had arrived in Argentina in the 40s, and then they had crossed. He'd met my grandmother, who was from the province of Buenos Aires. He was part of an itinerant theater group, and he was a great singer. And he met my grandmother, and they crossed over to Chile, to Santiago, and that's where they opened up this textile factory. And they landed in the house next door to my maternal grandparents, who came from this environment of culture, or the environment of science. My grandmother was dean of physics and mathematics at the University of Chile. So what ended up happening, I would say, is my mother's family were intellectuals, heavyweight intellectuals. Some half were on the science, the other half were in the humanities. But I think this concept that we're talking about, about the silencing and freedom of thought and expression, starts in the home with your parents. Those are the people that are opening your horizons and stimulating you to think right across the board, and be it in terms of knowledge, society, and so on. And I was very fortunate to be born into this environment where I was having all of these issues raised. Now, my mother was a socialist. So my mother always put before me issues to do with society, with freedom, with equality, with women's rights. I mean, my mother was way ahead on all of that, and this is something that through Nascimento, I'm also making a point. Too many people who are sadly a bit misinformed in terms of what they think Latin America is. No, Latin America is a hotbed of incredible ideas, and very often very far ahead of its time. It's no surprise that liberalism, liberal thinking, did start in Latin America with Europe, Europe and Latin America. For example, during the French Revolution, the Americans had, the French Revolution and the American Revolution are very closely
interlinked.
They're completely interlinked.
Yes, I mean, it was really an interesting time when empires kind of fell, because I mean, Louis XVI bankrolled the American Revolution, and in the process bankrupted himself. Now, he was trying to stick a finger in the eye of the British Empire, his main rival. The consequence of that being that he fomented a revolution in his own country, which, inspired by the American Revolution, which he had funded himself, then took his head off, and that of his whole aristocratic class, some of whom, I'm sure, fled to South America. And so you have these waves of these waves of migration, often due to revolution, and this irony that it was actually the American Revolution. It was something in the New World that created a revolution in the Old World.
And that's what I'm trying to get at, is that often, and being part of the Eurocentric world myself, I'm of European origin, clearly, and and I have all of this heritage that came from my ancestry in Europe. But when having grown up in Latin America, although I actually grew up mainly here in London since I was 8, but I was very lucky that my father would take me back to Argentina 3 times a year. So I lived through that entire process in Argentina of the military years, of seeing, people disappear. Even my mother was taken to prison for a year. And I was there the day that they took her. I was there when the soldiers came for her.
This was in the rise of Pinochet. So
This was right at the start.
Pinochet bombs Allende in the presidential palace,
yes,
and forms his coup. Before he was the head of the military under the Allende regime.
Yes,
so
exactly.
it was a palace coup, although they bombed the palace with fighter jets.
Yes, with Hawker Hunter,
British
Hawker Hunter jets.
The British Empire returns.
Which, if I may add, the day I was born,
yes,
Hawker Hunter jets, only a few minutes before I popped out, broke the sound barrier over Santiago. And because my mum and my dad were both pilots, they knew what that was, but a lot of people were really alarmed. What is this? My dad had to calm the medical staff down, saying, "Don't worry, that's aircraft breaking the sound barrier." Now, of course, I come from a completely aeronautical family. It used to be nautical for hundreds of years, or my Azorian ascendants. But then, I was born into a house of 2 pilots. And
so you're from a dynasty that's followed the technologies of the era. So book publishing and seafaring, and then moving into aeronautics,
into flight,
when that becomes the technology of the age. So
definitely.
So now we're doing that same process again. Where were we? We were at the rise of Pinochet. Your mother was taken to jail.
Yes.
More silencing occurs. In fact,
well, it's more than silencing.
Yes.
I mean, it's people straight out disappearing.
Yes, helicopters
over the sea, hands, tongues, and feet being chopped off and put into blocks of concrete and being thrown out into the open Pacific.
So we're now at a position where Chile is forming a new constitution, which is very exciting and something which should be celebrated. I think that the Constitutional Convention is going to be a very interesting one. To have one going on today is useful for humanity generally, and I think something we should really look at in detail as we go on. But let's examine the Tertulias. So our first topic is actually about this period, Project Cybersyn. Give us a little introduction to Project Cybersyn.
Project Cybersyn was a project that you could say was very similar in a way to the ARPANET in the United States. It was the first of its kind. It was a cybernetic project. The basis of cybernetic systems are to do with what you could call feedback loops in biological systems. I mean, your body is continuously monitoring itself and sending information back to the glands, ordering it to secrete X amount of hormones to regulate certain functions in the body. And those are loops that are being continuously monitored in your body.
So we have homeostasis of the body.
So you achieve.
Do we have homeostasis of the nation?
Well, you can never keep everybody happy. Homeostasis is like that light on the horizon towards which you walk. You take 2 steps towards that light and it takes 4 steps away from you. So it's not a destination. It's merely
an aspiration.
It's an aspiration. And I think even though not everybody who partakes in the plan can be happy, the fact that war or violence doesn't break out is already a triumph in itself. So I do think that the Project Cybersyn was built on the back of this idea because Allende, who was the first freely elected Marxist president on the planet, was a physician. And as a physician, in his ideal world, he wanted to build a system that would monitor levels of production around the country, have a direct incidence on the logistics of the produce, and be able to regulate the produce and distribution around the country as needed.
The longest and narrowest country in the world.
Yes.
You need a network of information distribution and recall to produce those feedback loops along such a long and narrow coastline.
Absolutely. With 5 different climates.
Yes. So this was a project of the Allende government of 1970 to 1973, Project Cybersyn. It was a collaboration between Allende as the newly elected socialist president of Chile and a Welsh cyberneticist and futurist.
I think Stafford Beer was English, and he ended up in Wales.
Okay.
He was an Englishman who moved to Wales.
Yes, he spent his time in his retirement there.
Yeah, and died there.
Yes, and so Stafford Beer, who was somewhat like a management consultant of his day for the production of the industry, maybe viewed in a slightly different light now in terms of what the Boston Consulting Group and Bain are, but nevertheless, in his time, he was a consultant to industry, and he came to Chile after the election of Allende and proposed to him a proto-internet to aggregate information across the country and bring it back.
Well, it was actually the other way around. He was summoned.
Oh, really?
Yes. The idea of Cybersyn is actually Allende's idea, and he set up a team from Corfo. Corfo is the Sociedad de Fomento of the society for the stimulation of industry and productivity. Sort of I don't know what the equivalent, what one could say. I mean, maybe a DTI,
yes,
somewhere along those lines. And as a doctor, he said, we need a cybernetic system in Chile to monitor food distribution. He knew what he was up against. He knew he was going to be boycotted.
Yes.
And he began to be boycotted by the, you know who? Mm-hmm. The truckers.
Yes. So the truckers, we looked into this. This is very interesting that now with the disturbances of the past few years. First, the Gilets jaunes in France, and then the truckers in Canada have represented forces of freedom in terms of these are the people that provide logistics, these are the people that provide the supply of food, and they were massively oppressed during the lockdown. So and even before it with the Gilets jaunes and the policies of Macron. In France, so there's a history of now about 5 or 6 years of truckers' revolts across maybe the French-speaking world, you might say, France and Canada, as being fundamentally in favour of liberty, and yet at that time in Chile, those same truckers were striking, but from a right perspective, as you were saying, they were disrupting the Allende government in terms of those logistics.
Yes,
but the Cybersyn was successful in preventing the government from falling due to those strikes.
Well, absolutely. I mean, they did manage to break a couple of those strikes using the Cybersyn system. Now, lest we forget, of course, that the truckers, the truckers syndicates were actually funded by the Ford Foundation and Coca-Cola.
Yes.
So they were paying the truckers to strike, and who in turn were being funded by the CIA.
Yes.
Obviously, the CIA doesn't really exist anymore in that same respect. It's very much changed now. Now you have the National Endowment for Democracy carrying out what the CIA used to do. But then what you had was this funding of the truckers by the CIA via Ford Foundation and Coca-Cola. And the objective, of course, is to bring the country to its knees. Henry Kissinger famously says, make their economy, and Nixon, make the economy scream. That's the most famous phrase. That's where it comes from. It comes from that situation where they said, let's get the truckers to grind the country to absolute halt and make the economy scream.
So this Project Cybersyn system, a proto-internet developed by a socialist government during the 1970s, without the support of ARPA, without the support of the major powers of that day, in a country which those major powers saw as being captured by socialism, although elected, and wished to disrupt. That system had a couple of kilobytes of memory over the whole country.
Probably,
it was when we looked into it, it was astonishing, the level of success. And what really fascinated me about it, in terms of our thinking today, is that it formed what you might see as a proto-blockchain. It was a decentralized network of stores of information, which then could inform one another as to the economic value, where it lay, how to organize it. That's some of where we might be going with a blockchain future economy.
Yes.
And so we can look back at the lessons of history and learn from them as to how to articulate it well. I mean, we've started looking at Stafford Beer's writings, and he was a futurist of his day. The most interesting of his pronouncements in the introduction to his book on reflecting on the period was that the Industrial Revolution is in nobody's eyes a revolution. It's actually an evolution. And so I think there's a massive mine of gold in Stafford Beer's reflections on that period, in which we can dissect as we go on and with this project and learn from further. So Project Cybersyn exists in Chile, major success. Suddenly it wakes up the world and the ARPA structures that there's a competing attempt to network
with different objectives,
with very different objectives, and so it gets shut down.
Socially minded objectives rather than profit led. That's what it was really. That's what the main point was about. is that it really was, and didn't feature monetary recompense, or the possibility of giving maximum returns, maximum yields, but it really was about
to maximize shareholder value. Yes.
but to return maximum value in terms of availability of food, distribution,
Yes.
making the nation resilient against.
So the key is to really locate where the human value lies. And I think, speaking of the reading room at the British Museum, as far as our analysis at the New Athens has led us so far, it seems that Marx's use value, as instantiated in Project Cybersyn, so looking at where the real human value lies in products, in produce, in production, rather than maximizing shareholder value, as you say, within a company structure, maybe Marx was writing for the blockchain age. Maybe Marx was writing for the networked age, in the same way that, say, Jung was writing for Twitter. I mean, Jung had this idea of the collective unconscious.
Yes.
Of course,
yeah.
when you have to suppose it as a numinous idea of, the spirit of the age which infuses people, even though they don't know what one another is thinking, but they're all thinking the same thing. Okay, maybe they have the same stimuli. Of course, now in a technical platform in Twitter, we can see the collective unconscious live at work.
Yes. Yes.
So perhaps some of these visionary writers were writing with a view to a level of technology that the society at the time didn't possess. Maybe it had possessed it in the past, maybe it would possess it in the future, but at that time it was kind of isolated on an island. So I mean, this is all good fodder for further discussion, further work. On that note, the Tertulias, as they have been, as they're being revived, are a series of debates. Our first major topic is that of smart cities, because again, this is a term which we've got to recapture. I think it's been a term that's been colonized by those globalist powers that we've been discussing, those silencers. At the moment, in their less nefarious version of online censorship, but I'm sure we're not that far from Pinochet's excesses if we allow this to continue. In terms of top-down command and control structures, which we see being built around us, and we've seen during the lockdown, we've seen in those repressions of the Gilets jaunes, the trucker strikes, people self-organizing is a danger to the power structures that wish to control us, that wish to impose a top-down network grid of social control, a social credit system, centralized bank digital currencies, which we see coming in, all these different perversions of technology. So these we have to discuss, and we're programming a series of events here in London called the Tertulias de Nascimento, or Rinascimento, the rebirth, the renaissance. And so tonight, I think let's go on to discuss, what does a renaissance look like? We have lots of prospects. We have the prospect of a free internet using blockchain technology. We have the lessons of projects like Cybersyn, which we can draw upon, and which we need to research further. But yeah, so a smart city, which is our first major topic of discussion. We worked on a definition of a smart city as smart, green, resilient infrastructure to build the city of the future. That is a future that we want to see decentralized, that the powers of Davos and so on, which met last week, want to see highly centralized. And so part of what we're trying to build is a decentralized network of information. Now, that's an information network that spans book publishing with physical distribution of information across the world, and then a digital a digital freedom, a digital decentralization through blockchain technology and other affiliated technologies to allow people to have freedom of expression, and that includes the expression, the expression of money, as we've seen with the Bitcoin revolution, which is a revolution.
Definitely.
And so where we're at is we're bringing together thinkers, academics, professionals in various fields of infrastructure, of technology. We're trying to bring those together in person in London at debates and speaker events. This in 2023, they're starting soon, and Pablo will discuss a little more of that in a bit. Then also online through this portal of an online think tank. So the anti-Davos has met this past week. They are building a highly disciplined program of global rollout, Operation Lockstep, which we saw during the lockdown of nations all becoming the middle managers of the supra government, national governments becoming programmed entities in a much larger body politic. Now, where are we at in terms of Chile? There's a new constitutional convention. There's a lot of prospect of deleting some of the excesses of the constitution under Pinochet. Where is Chile today?
Well, I always, as I've said to you before, what I always find curious about Chile, although I never lived there for too long. I went to live there in 2019 for almost a year, and it was a real eye opener. Because my main contacts throughout my life have been more with Argentina due to my father and so on. So it was an interesting moment to go to Chile when the social upheaval took place. So for me, it was like reliving the coup all over again. Now, what I will say about Chile is, as with CyberSyn, what follows in Chile is also a world first. That is the first implementation of neoliberal societies. Chile is the first country on the planet to actually implement a model built around the Chicago School of Milton Friedman.
Yes.
And the way that it does that is that Pinochet sends a number of young economic students, young Chileans, sends these young students to Chicago to study under Milton Friedman. And they return with a big proposal in the shape of a book, which is a big, wide, tall book, which was called The Brick. So you can imagine what it looked like. They return with the brick, and what the brick actually says is privatize, 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 and privatize. And this, of course, was going completely contrary to what Allende's socialist government intended on doing.
So within a couple of years, we have a radical socialist government with a radical plan for decentralization. And then we have a radical fascist government, which has downloaded notions of the Chicago School of Milton Friedman to then be an experimental petri dish for using Chile to try out neoliberalism.
Absolutely.
Before it conquered the West, it was sandboxed in Chile.
It was 6-7 years before the arrival of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who were the first ones in the wider Western world to actually implement Pinochet's experiment, which explains their love of Pinochet.
Well, as today we can see globalist governments having experimented in China with the social credit system, now looking to export that experiment to Anglophone nations, interestingly.
Yes.
We see it in some states in America. We see it in Britain, being major imperial centers. But also, and especially, we've seen it during the lockdown in Canada, in New Zealand, and in Australia. And we looked into this a little during the lockdown, and we found that actually the legal basis of governance in Canada, Australia, New Zealand is the panopticon, is the prison governor, is direct rule of the British Crown. You see, in Australia and New Zealand and Canada, they've never chopped a king's head off, or as in America, they've never forced a king to retreat across the Atlantic. And so the basis on which the laws are founded is, it may be called the common law, but it has none of the features of the common law. We had Saxon common law in England. We chopped a king's head off in 1649. In America, they had their revolution of 1776. They created a written constitution. But what we're experiencing now is the rollout of a Chinese top-down social credit system using the internet, inverting the internet, as we said earlier. So using the internet not as a means of free expression of people at the grassroots level, but instead using the internet as a means of monitoring and the creation of another kind of matrix of information tracking, but not for the freedom of humanity, but for the control and regulation of humanity. And so we see that rollout first in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, with the strongest lockdowns in the Western world. Now, why? Because the legal precedent is there, and then the governments of the day can draw it out of the statute book to say we are prison complexes. We have a prison governor, and we can regulate the humans as if they are convicts. Now, of course, there's a dressing up of parliamentary democracy and so on. But that's the fundamental basis. We saw similar in France, Italy, Spain, Germany, which have had histories of fascism. So that during the lockdown, they were able to find in their statute books the precedents to lock down the population. In Britain and in America, lockdown was in the mind. The lockdown was a psychological experience. If you acceded to it, then it would exist. If you didn't accede to it, in fact, it was proven in the courts, certainly in Britain and in many states in America, that the government had no right to lock people down. It was proven by the cases of Mary Dinu here in Britain and in Scotland, which we discussed when they happened during the lockdown. So a lockdown in the mind, a lockdown in the statute book, a rollout across English-speaking countries. We can see this experimentation in China and in Chile as we've been going through. So, how did neoliberalism get exported from Chile?
Well, I think obviously with the military coup having been clearly openly funded through the CIA, the State Department, and with a full complicity, I always think that these plans have already been set up long before they are actually ever get implemented. And Chile's always been a bit of an experimental ground in many respects. It had been with the cyber sin, it had been with this experiment with Allende trying to build a different society. And now it was going to go in completely the opposite direction and try and build this neoliberal society with the auspices of the UK and the US. Chile has always been very close to Britain. Chile and Britain go back, as you know, this year it's 200 years, which by American standards is a long time, of diplomatic relations. But the British have had, like the French had in the US, the British had that same presence in Latin America, trying to boycott the Spanish dominion. So that relationship that already existed meant that there was already some intention to monitor a 6-7 year experiment because there was some sort of plan to construct a similar model in these bigger nations, if you like.
So we're experiencing the rollout of 5-year plans, the rollout of national
That
experiments.
sort of thing, correct.
And so now it's time to start. Thank you, Oliver. Now it's time to start creating some plans of our own from a grassroots level, and this is where we begin with the Tertulias in London and online.
Yes, I think it's very important, because you said earlier, you were talking about creating, these societies, more democratic societies, through this P2P connectivity. The problem with democracy is it's not something that happens by magic. If you don't have civically empowered individuals, then you can't have democracy. If individuals are distracted by ignorance, how on earth are they going to partake in a democracy which requires some form of civic engagement?
Yes.
And that means education.
We've certainly been looking at education a great deal recently. Some of our friends over at the Bad Law Project have begun their bad education program, which is very exciting in terms of looking at some of the excesses in woke ideology that are going on in the education system. But more globally than that, in terms of publishing, in terms of the internet, people can use the internet to learn Latin using Duolingo. You can do language games and progress in a gamified environment in an app to learn Latin. You can access every university library along with archive.org, gallica.fr, manuscript facsimiles, which we've been looking at and we'll show some later. You can access all of this wealth of information through the internet, which before was subject to gatekeeping by universities and before that monasteries. Now, so at the time, you could see a university library as a building, as the gatehouse for knowledge. So if you could provide that library card, you could enter into the location that knowledge was stored and access education. Now we're in a position where we've liberalized information in the internet, but we've not incentivized people to stop looking at cat videos, scrolling on TikTok and wanking, so that they can actually be well motivated and well incentivized and well recompensed for educating themselves. So what we've been experimenting with is paying people to get educated. I think that this, looking at the progress we've been making in crowdfunding and looking at the progress that's been made with the blockchain, is something that we can really try and push in 2023.
P2P empowerment.
Exactly, empowering technologies. So the notion being, back to Marxian use value, back to cybersyn, that education in our neoliberal society is viewed as a private good. So if I educate myself, I should indebt myself for the product of education, which I'll then use for my private benefit in my earning capacity, in a marketplace, in a job marketplace, where I can say, well, my skills and my Anglo stamp education will give me more earning power over a certain period of time. So therefore, it's a private good which profits me, and then so therefore I should pay for that as a product. That's the current marketing model of education. Now, if we invert that and look at it from the cybersyn consciousness, we might see.
And sorry, might I add, it's a great idea to learn to invert any model.
Yes,
and they're all invertible. They're all invertible, all of them.
So, so those scripts, if you flip those scripts, what you see is education as a public good, not a private good. If I get educated, and I can then involve myself in the production, whether that be the production of bronze statues, whether that be the production of microprocessors, whether that be the production of baked goods. That's a public good, not a private good. Because the more education that occurs, the more people can congregate in cities, the more people can feed off one another's ideas, discourse, and interactions to create innovative technologies, and so on. So
And I think
if
that's
we
the point.
value that education in a front-weighted way, so that we say, okay, instead of I get student loans, I pay for those student loans over the period of 20 years. I'm then in the debtor class based on the fact that I wanted to get an education and fulfill my potential within society to maximize the capacity of my mind. Then now we if we can reevaluate where human value lies along those use value lines of Marx, and looking at that within a blockchain framework of where are the exchanges of real human value that we see in our economy, there's a free marketplace of ideas.
Correct.
That's what we're trying to build towards at the moment. And so paying people to get educated, every hour of labor that you do should be recompensed, whether that's the deliberation and voting in a democracy. That should not be a civic duty, that should be civic labor, and that should be compensated per hour of useful work. This is why we have a democratic deficit. People who are independently wealthy have access to time that they can devote to, they can spend on political action and political participation. Everybody else doesn't have the time because they can't spend that capital,
and they haven't had the time to educate themselves in order to evaluate what the possibilities of democratic participation could actually lead to. Because this is the important bit about everything that you're saying is, an educated person enables.
How many glasses? Anyone at all?
Philip Fiersov, everybody, come say hello.
I'm just going to bring a few glasses of wine.
Ciao bello.
We've got the bottle.
If you lean down, say hello. This is Philip Fiersov, sculptor, painter, art historian, philosopher. You're looking in there. Philip's going to get some wine for our assembled studio audience.
He doesn't drink.
And
who wants to drink? Do you want a
No,
glass?
remember,
then
I
we're
don't
going to
do
hear
alcohol.
from Philip on his testimony about education online.
Ollie, a glass?
Yes.
Okay. Marina?
Okay.
No.
A few glasses.
A glass?
A few glasses.
Okay,
Thanks,
so
Phil.
3, yeah.
Could you, Phil?
Yeah.
I would, if you had a glass of water, that would be.
Okay. Yeah.
Grazie, carissimo. Grazie.
So yeah, we'll hear from Philip in a moment about his experiment this month in online education, which is very interesting. It's a platform.
Well, because that's where it all lies, isn't
Platform
it?
called Bigo.com. And so Philip's an educator in the field of arts and history. He's a sculptor. He's a painter. He is an art historian. And he's now found an experimental platform called Bigo.com, which allows, it seems to be an AI harvesting tool for creative work. So the parameters of the platform were very interesting. We looked into them. Are that it allows people to be paid in magic beans. I shit you not. For live streaming content. So Philip, pull up a chair. And tell us a little about Bigo.com.
Okay,
because no, pull up a chair because otherwise you're out of the shot. There's one upstairs or there. There's one in the hallway upstairs. So Philip has some testimony for us about this platform, which may form a good case study for online education and knowledge distribution. So he's been experimenting with it this month, and we wanted to bring you the scoop here. Bigo.com. If you can take a look at it. It allows individuals to live stream video content into the Bigo platform and pays them in magic beans, which can be redeemable for cash. Now,
Right. So basically,
yeah, tell us a little bit about Bigo, Philip, and
I've
your
just been
experiences
doing
with
that
it.
for an hour, and I've changed the portrait that we had in here. And
Oh, that was somebody else.
Yeah.
I recognize this.
But,
I recognize
what
this.
I've done is I've done some modeling over the surface and explained how to do glazing for an hour to an audience of about 300 people who I've never met.
Fantastic.
Basically, I had an expressionist portrait here made out of dark blue and green in there and everything, and it was done very quickly from life. So I took burnt sienna, white, a little bit of yellow, and mainly with white, really, just glazed over the surface and explained how to unify all the marks on the surface. And I was looking at an Italian Renaissance painting from somewhere in Renaissance Italy. I don't know, typical curly hair, looks a bit like Botticelli.
Yes.
So I've changed the portrait with a few marks. But this is one of 40 or 50 hours of painting that I've been doing live on this app. So it's making education completely free and democratic for everybody, because instead of paying me for an art lesson and me going around onto an app where people have got to all come together at the same time, or me going
in a
to
sort of industrial fashion, as if they were in a factory.
Yeah, and everything then
Days
is
work.
about synchronized learning and about time waiting for people to all get from stage 1 to stage 2. Instead of that, it's just people coming into a room, a chat room, and they can write to me and ask me questions or call in, or I can just be going on about it and making it and just looking in, making sure everybody's happy, But
Just as has happened now, where we've gone from politics to arts, and this is what the Renaissance was all about.
Exactly.
It was
The industrialization of art.
Disciplinary.
Exactly.
It took art. It was about improvising. It was about enjoying life. So it's no wonder it started in Tuscany.
There's a book you must read, actually.
Right,
It's called
somewhere
Painting and
behind.
Experience in the 15th Century by an academic called Baxendall. You must read this, because what it discusses is how in the Renaissance painters were paid in a different fashion via their contracts. So in the medieval period, the contract for painting was based on square yards of wall space filled for fresco painting. And so painters were considered to be builders. They were considered to be like tradesmen. And this is an interesting point with regard to the professionalization of art.
Well, we're much
we're
more,
seeing now.
much more highly skilled, but not as well paid now.
So Baxendall shows
right.
how
I'm going to borrow that bottle and open it up.
that a per yard system of contract for medieval artists painting frescoes in churches was replaced in the Renaissance by a subject-based model of payment. So instead of saying, right, I'll have 5 square yards with this amount of gilding. So the two things that were paid for were size of painting and cost of materials. So actually, to increase the overall contract value, you saw artists were incentivized to use gilding on painted surfaces, because of course, in terms of materials cost, they could charge a premium against the value of the gilding used on their paintings. Now, in the Renaissance, in the Renaissance, you see welcome and happy New Year to everybody. And so Baxendall charts how in the Renaissance the model of contracts changed, whereby instead of looking at the materials and the size, we saw contracts based on subject matter and number of finished faces. Now, this then brought about the School of Art model, where you would have a master produce the face and hands of a composition of figures,
understudies and stuff,
and understudies would fill in the rest, because the contract value lay in the sophistication of the composition, of the execution, which actually led industrially to a great deal of innovation in the field of painting. Whereas you'd had centuries of flat, perspective-free fresco, Byzantine style art, then you saw you saw a freer marketplace of ideas opening up, because it was your plasterer and your painter weren't in the same industrial bracket. Instead, the painter became a creative profession, and then that led to innovation in that field as painters could get paid more as innovators in their field, producing work that was sought after, rather than with long form contracts to monasteries and churches. So this is a really fascinating book, and it also talks about hand gestures in Renaissance art, how we can't read them today. Baxendale, Painting and Experience in the 15th Century, stunning read, and really
What is it called again?
Baxendale, Painting and Experience in the 15th Century.
I'm going to read.
Yeah, it's definitely
How do
interesting.
you spell Baxendale?
Baxandall.
Is that a Dutchman?
English art historian,
okay.
I believe.
Oh, it's not a historian, not somebody that lived at the time.
No. He's writing recently.
Okay.
So why this is of interest? Firstly, we were talking about the industrialization of art, and we'll talk about it further with Dr. Bigo. But secondly, then you can see the same story with Beethoven, actually another of our touchstones at the New Athens. He was the first emancipated freelance composer that really made a career of ticket sales for the premieres of new work. He once premiered, I think it was 3 symphonies and 2 piano concerti and the choral fantasia, all at the same time in the same concert hall. So he'd get huge subscription sales for tickets. He wrote probably the greatest resignation letter ever from Prince Lisnowski, who was one of his patrons, who said to whom he said, "Prince, everything you are by accident of birth alone. There will always be thousands of princes, but throughout all of recorded time, there will only ever be one Beethoven." That was his resignation letter. He emancipated himself from being a court creature, a creature of aristocratic patronage, into being a self-made composer and impresario who would premiere his own works for tickets. Now, what's interesting about this is if you look at even great composers of the previous generation, Mozart and Haydn, these people were treated as basic employees of a court structure. They would eat at the table with the manservants and the indentured staff.
And many died poor.
They weren't considered to be creative professionals. They were considered to be plasterers, like the equivalent of
workers
of
a
the
guild
of the guild system and the medieval workers who we were talking about with painters. So you see different industries in the arts emancipating themselves on different tracks, and the economy of these art fields then gaining access to the will to innovate based on incentives. Now, what I wanted to get onto with you, Philip, was incentives with this Bigo.com. You were telling me about how it had re-incentivized your work in the past few weeks.
Well, I've had 2 months of time to be on there, and in that time I've started off by giving examples of different kinds of painting and drawing, starting off in my house and then taking this camera with me to museums and places in the street. So the other day I ended up in Chinatown during Chinese New Year, and I was painting with crowds of people walking past the lions in the middle of Gerrard Street. So it became more like a journalistic journey through painting in different situations in the open museums in the evenings as well. But so when we had this pandemic, all of the teaching jobs that I could do in person collapsed. And so suddenly I couldn't see people and nobody could see anybody. And so the age of video lessons opened up much more. We were able to do this much earlier. We had the technology, but nobody wanted to do it. And then suddenly we had, 100 people on a lesson online, organized to come all at the same time to one lesson. And then there'd be the agents who were getting a lot of money and paying me about 50% or 40% of the money they got. And then that would be very democratic because we could have 100 kids paying £5 each to get an hour's lesson. So it was much cheaper than what I was doing before, which was going maybe to a person's house and charging them 50-60 pounds an hour for one lesson with one child. Suddenly then I'd have 100 children and they'd all be paying £5.
So here's a democratization of your very specialized knowledge.
And then after that, on the next stage was this idea of social media. So, I could just do a live on Facebook or on Instagram and see who comes up. but that wouldn't. The engines in those social media are not big enough to open up. What Bigger is doing is giving you a channel where in a space of an hour I could have 500 or 600 people join the session. Now they might not be painting and they might not be artists, but they could get this information. They could see me working every day, and then they could tune into this, and they could get their kids to tune into this. So I don't know who's watching me, but I know for a fact that hundreds of people are seeing this. So that's a much more effective way to spread knowledge and inspiration. So over
But what
2
you were
months,
telling me
yeah,
was that you had been remotivated to do different kinds of work yourself
yeah,
in these sessions. That's
Yeah.
what we were. That's why.
yeah,
We get
because I'd taken my old drawing, because suddenly I have to fill up, 50 hours a month of time, and so that means working every day basically. And so that means I could take all my older work I hadn't finished at university and rework that, and then test out ideas like taking it in front of certain buildings that I wanted to paint and actually set it up there. When it's a bit warmer, I can do more of that. But we did it the other day in front of St. Albans Abbey. I had a painting that had started, never finished, and then I had the time to fill and the time to explain what I'd been doing to other people. So by explaining what you're doing, you're then having to actually do it more and finish it off. And the agency is incentivizing other people to join this, and also they're paying the hosts, the people on there, a
In
small
magic
amount of
beans.
money in beans that then so these beans build up at the end of the month, and then people can give you beans as well on the app, and then these beans you can convert into currency at the end of the month. So that way I'm being paid to do my job as a teacher with a much bigger audience.
So Philip's decentralized himself and found a larger audience through live streaming. That's an interesting work example of where we're
It's
going.
not like standing in a gallery or going to a private lesson. It's like hundreds of people suddenly.
He's democratized his learning and knowledge transmission by reaching a larger audience, and he's been incentivized to look at work that he had sitting on a shelf, improve it, re-engage with it.
So I've taken all these photographs I had in my trips to different cathedrals. Like this morning I was working from photographs from York Cathedral that I'd visited, and I always thought I must paint that, but I never had the time to actually sit down and go through these photographs and say, right, I really think I can make a painting from this. Or my hundreds of pictures from Venice, my trips so over the lockdown I was working from Venice, painting in Venice, and doing live streams where people were watching me paint out there. And I also had all these sketches and photographs that I'd brought back. So in that time, I used that time to paint from them. And
sorry, but in Venice, out on the streets during the lockdown?
Yeah, on the streets.
Because I mean, the Italian police were. I mean, how did you manage that?
Well, they didn't mind me being outside, but you had to wear a mask. But it was totally abandoned. So I was doing a live stream on St. Mark's Square with nobody there.
Wow, that must have been surreal.
Yeah,
that must
now
have been
now
surreal.
You wouldn't be able to do it, because now they'd come. Actually, the last thing I had was an encounter with them where I just laid out my watercolors on a bench in St. Mark's Square, and they came and said, "You're exhibiting. There are tourists here. You could be making money. We don't know what you're doing, but you need a permission, so leave the square immediately."
Guardia di Finanza.
Yeah. But you see, a year before that, there was just me and them on the square, and they didn't care because there were no tourists.
Yeah.
So that's still a big change.
Italy's a great place to have adventures, isn't it? Really,
Yeah.
you never stop.
Yes.
Really.
Watch out! You don't write your own money. You're painting, write your own money.
We weren't allowed to have
fall under the auspices.
We weren't allowed to have a gathering like this in our own flat that we'd rented with my friend Michael, because we weren't related to the people in the family
by blood.
So we had marriage. 3 or 4 visits. Well, in one evening, when we had drinks like this, sat around a table with some Italians that we'd met in the street, and we said, "That's my fratello, sorella," and then they'd see their passport, and it was like, Mr. Michael Bucknell, Philip Fursov, and then Giovanni Rossi, like, okay, they're not related. So, but they didn't fine us, but we had multiple visits and the neighbours peering in. So
well, I was in Italy recently. I went for the vendemmia with my winemaker friends to Florence, and it was hilarious because we went to my friend. He bought a big piece of land where he's putting down his vigna and putting out all the grapes and so on. And then upon returning, we get to a roundabout, and there's carabiniere, flagging us down. And I was with my friend Ernesto. Ernesto's from Argentina's largest wine producing family. And they flag us down and they start asking Ernesto for all the documents. Ernesto's from Argentina. I mean, he's got Italian heritage. His surname is Catena. But, he doesn't know all the documents he needs to have in his car. So he starts, Signore, can we have what was it? Tessera di circolazione. I think Ernesto said, what? What do you mean tessera di circolazione? What is that? So just look, what documents do you have? Oh, well, I've got this. And maybe this one, maybe not. Oh, no, this one or this one. It turns out we didn't have all the documents, but as he's doing that and looking for the right documents, I start talking with the carabiniere. And how come you speak Italian like that and so on? I said, well, I grew up in Italy when I was a kid, etc., etc. And then I start singing the praises of Sardinia as one of the most beautiful islands I've ever laid my eyes upon. And as Ernesto's continuing getting himself into more and more trouble because he can't find the document, I'm talking to this guy about Sardinia and the beauty, and he turns around, the policeman turns around and says, Io sono sardo.
You struck a chord.
I struck exactly the right chord. Oh, you're from Sardinia? He goes, yes, and you are very right. Sardinia is so beautiful. You can go. He says, normally we fine you for these things, but
in the circumstances.
Go in the circumstances, you can go.
So thinking about different kinds of employment, we were building up this Odessa documentary last night, and I came across a very, very interesting Soviet. Have you ever heard of the Soviet of the Unemployed?
No.
They were very significant in Odessa during the Russian Revolution. I'll tell you about the Soviet of the Unemployed. I think it's very interesting.
So this is Tsarist Russia.
So this is Odessa, 1917.
Yeah.
The Tsar has abdicated after the February Revolution. The October Revolution. Well, the provisional government exists of liberals and the Bolshevik Party in advance of the October Revolution, when Lenin and the Bolsheviks take over and expel the liberals from the Duma and the socialists. And so at this time, in Odessa, Odessa wants to federate to the emerging provisional government separately from Kiev. Because Kiev is declaring autonomy at the time, and then later independence from Russia. There was then a war brewing between Ukraine, as defined by the Kiev and its surroundings, actually very similar to the current borders that Putin is drawing. So a Ukrainian autonomous unit that didn't include Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, or Odessa, or the Black Sea coast of Odessa. So this was the entity that was then declaring independence from Russia, seeing that this vacuum of power had led to an opportunity for an independent Ukraine. Novorossiya, which is Odessa, the Black Sea coast, Crimea.
That's where my ancestors, some of my
Donetsk and
ancestors
Luhansk
came from. Yeah,
was not included in Ukraine at that time, and they didn't want to get involved in a war between the new socialist government in St. Petersburg and
Moscow
and Kiev. So at that time, Odessa formed its own Soviet party, but one of the very significant Soviet councils that came into existence was the Soviet of the Unemployed. And I'll read you this little briefing on them, because the most fascinating thing in this revolutionary period we were looking at last night. The Bolsheviks in Odessa found important support in the Soviet of the Unemployed. Odessa had an influential unemployed movement in 1917, which created its own Soviet and stormed onto the city's political stage with radical demands. Due to the war, revolution, and economic decline, a very large new underclass had developed in the city, made up of a diverse array of people. According to trade unions, approximately 6,000 qualified workers and 5,000 unskilled workers were affected by unemployment in October 1917 during this revolution. In addition to this, there were approximately 10,000 unemployed soldiers and a large number of unemployed people from graduate professions, whose precise number was difficult to determine. The unemployed Jewish teacher Chaim Wright recognized the revolutionary potential of this diverse new underclass. Now, what was interesting here was have we revived this revolutionary underclass during the lockdown? I mean, Philip was telling us a little bit about being disenfranchised as a worker.
We're just not allowed to see anybody. Yeah, if you can't see anybody, the only way you can meet is through social media or on your phone.
With some sort of agent in between you and the
Exactly.
person.
Now this agency is where we
And then when we've opened up after the lockdown has finished, a lot of people have stayed online if they can, but a lot of online businesses have packed up, and then people are coming back to real meetings. But
well, I mean, unless you've been totally absorbed by Mark Zuckerberg's proposal to jump on board the metaverse,
yes,
where you can disappear forever and never to return.
Up
But
your own arse, yes.
Somewhere
over the rainbow.
Somewhere over the rainbow, yes. Yes, a rather smelly rainbow, but okay.
But okay, so you're talking about a Bolshevik revolution, which is all to do with a class of people that were poor and unemployed and serfs that had become suddenly unfed by their masters. So, of course, they had a revolution to fight, and that was to do with a population that needed to get into an industry, and then the Bolsheviks used that. But then, of course, the flip side of that was that half of them disappeared into the gulag. And,
yes, of course. I mean, so they didn't know.
Killed.
They didn't know what
they were prepped. This is what's happening now. You're giving your opinion right here. In about 5 years' time, they're going to come knocking for you.
Mm-hmm.
Unless we act now.
Well, I mean, in Russia, if anybody says anything against the war, they lose their job and they get arrested now.
I mean, the problem is that, you know, when I go on social media and have a look, I sometimes get the impression that we're not far off the same situation.
No, not at all.
Without the explicit threat of arrest and being scooted off to a gulag, I think we're in a situation where people do self-censor to a great degree. I think people are intuitively scared in a different way to the way that people were in Latin America, for example, when I was a kid, growing up in these dictatorships where I was explicitly told whenever I went off to Buenos Aires to see my dad to don't say anything about anything because you don't know who you are talking to.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I always heard from people, that if you had any political views or you read any books that were not officially approved, you were putting yourself in danger in the whole of Latin America. Mm-hmm. That's Latin America in the 70s and 80s and maybe just the beginning of the 90s, where you weren't free to think like you wanted. So I saw that, and I couldn't say that right now I'm looking at a situation that is all too dissimilar.
Well, we're selling our birthright for a couple of months' rent, as Walter White would say. So where are we at with that? Well,
are you going to read the manifesto?
We're casting to the winds. I mean, that's a little flavour, but we're casting to the winds the protections that we had under the law in terms of free speech, in terms of free expression, free travel.
Displacement is fundamental. Look, that's why cars are the backbone of democracy.
Well, now we're looking at 15-minute cities. We're looking at climate lockdowns, as the WEF at the Davos conference this past week have been pushing. This is in the programming.
By the way, I travelled without injection, and I was given off the street by some street urchins in Venice the COVID pass of Emmanuel Macron. And I would go into hotels in Rome and Venice and show this pass, and people would say, "Mr. Macron, you're very welcome to have a drink at the bar."
You might have been his cousin or brother.
Well, I could have been somebody
man
called Mr.
himself,
Macron,
yes.
but I travelled with this for about a month until suddenly, on the last day before I flew off, it expired, and it didn't work anymore, so I couldn't go into things. But I was in Berlin for New Year, and my mother had written a piece for the orchestra, and she wasn't vaccinated, and so she wasn't allowed into the concert hall. And
Oh, really?
And so she sat
wow.
backstage, and she was allowed only to come in to bow after her piece had been played by the orchestra. But
So she was allowed in the building
Yeah.
where she could have transmitted whatever plague that she had in her body to the other attendees of the building and the workers backstage. But then she wasn't allowed to sit in the audience with the bourgeoisie, even though
she'd
she
written
was
a
the
piece.
composer of the piece.
And she
So
bowed
here-
and then she left. And at that point, I decided, I got so angry with them that I just went into the hall and watched the concert. And when the concert finished and she'd finished bowing and stopped clapping, I just ran. And the people were chasing me down the corridor. And I shouted to them that my name is Beethoven. And eventually I broke through the door to the backstage and I stood by my mum and said, "This is my colleague, the other composer."
No, it's well, it's
So that's how I started last
crazy-
year.
Yes.
No, that's absolutely brilliant.
I
think you
managed
did
to
us all a
travel
favour.
everywhere without a vaccine, and I don't have a vaccine, and I don't plan on getting one.
No, I think a lot more people than is immediately apparent don't plan on getting one, and I do speak to people who've had one, and a lot of them are very worried.
Mhm.
And we're
A
seeing
lot of
sports people die suddenly.
are very
alarming
very
ways.
concerned. So right now we're in that situation where if you read up on the details of how this whole thing got implemented, where governments have given complete immunity to pharmaceuticals
from
and
being sued for the side effects,
for being
or
sued,
adverse
etc.
effects
All of
of
those
their
things.
medicines
I mean,
and so
if you
forth.
didn't notice that and you went ahead and got jabbed, then I suggest you really ought to have done a lot better.
On that note, Mehul is here with us. He's been producing an amazing feed on Instagram lately, which I've been following. Come in. Look, come
Right,
pull
yeah,
up a
I'll
chair.
come and stop with you.
If there's space.
Come join us. So Mehul has been producing an amazing feed of
It's easy.
of
Hello, everyone.
free speech pro free speech propaganda on Instagram, which I've been following for the past few months with rapt attention. You're really on the point
In the
of
early
the
days,
news.
yeah.
So how did you begin that feed, and where are you at? And I haven't seen you in a while.
Well, it all started with me. Actually, I had big hopes. You know, I was like, we can get out of this situation. You know how it is. We all thought, let me get out of it. There was a seed of doubt right at the beginning, like a lot of people. If you're already on that wavelength, you'll always have a seed of doubt, thinking, hey, it sounds too good to be true. You know, we've had this new thing coming over allegedly, new alleged infection. And, the time is allegedly 8:58. I try and, reiterate that everything is allegedly true. And I got to the stage where one day the vaccine was out and my mother came over and she explained. She goes, if you don't take it, then it's not likely that I'm going to see you again. I was like, well, on that bombshell, I guess adios. I will see you later. It's been a pleasure. It really has, And this was on my birthday that she'd come over and said that. And I'd say, please, I'd like you to leave, because it's quite rude to say something like that to someone on their birthday. And out of respect. And from that point onwards, I'd realized that the mind virus had fully infected people all around the world. And me too, I was really scared at the beginning. A lot of people felt around about March, April time in 2020.
Yes,
it was quite
huge amount of plague propaganda.
Oh, there was a
But there wasn't even
sense
plague propaganda. I had a friend, an old Italo-Scottish aristocrat, who died.
Yes.
He died. He flew in from Italy. 10 days later, he's dead. That's an old friend of mine.
Well, it was interesting. Right at the start of the lockdown, there was one of these historical moments of calling back a story, and the story was the Spanish flu of 1918-19, and mainstream media had never covered the Spanish flu in our lifetimes, and yet suddenly this touchstone of history, this callback moment came where pictures were disseminated of people collapsing in the streets in 1918 versus in Wuhan and Chinese footage of people collapsing in the streets,
which never happened in real life,
of unclear provenance.
Yeah.
And then you saw this mainstream media narrative coalesce of this is the Spanish flu Mark II. It's a century later, and it's Gaia, it's nature purging us.
I'm sure.
In a Gaia theory, and so yeah, you saw that propaganda come together with this weird historical moment of the very serious Spanish flu of 1918, which killed a lot of young people. And there was this notion, oh well, this is the same thing. I mean, it's a purge. It's like a genetic purge of the planet. That was a very strong propaganda move. It didn't materialize. People weren't dropping dead in the streets. So and in fact, it was people with underlying and pre-existing conditions. That
I mean, the average age of death was 83 or 84.
They were very much affected
which was
by this.
Beyond the age of the average death that you'd normally
Longevity.
have anyway. Which, not to say that, you know, those people may have died from a flu infection anyway at that age. You know?
Look,
if you looked
it's
at the
very
flu
simple.
statistics
It's
of
not
2020.
difficult to have an ailment.
Yeah.
It's not even difficult to make
Yeah.
an ailment.
Yeah.
So it's not a question of doubting the existence of a virus.
Absolutely not.
No.
I'm not on that.
No,
I'm
that's
not on
not at
that.
all.
I still meet people on a regular basis that doubt the entire existence of something.
No. The
Where
virus
I'm not on
existed.
that page.
Well, there was a statistical aggregation. So there was definitely an infection that came out of Wuhan, and now we've seen some of the paper trail and audit to demonstrate how that came to be, which we can discuss later with regards to Fauci and with regards to the development of AIDS viruses and bat coronaviruses in that American structure
and
then in
SARS
China
back in the
Um,
90s.
but where we got to was a disease which colonized the flu statistics. If you look at the national statistics, certainly for Britain, and I believe for America as well, this is well documented. In 2020, there was no flu. So in every year, there's a standard level of flu in the national statistics as to people being admitted to hospital, people with serious flu conditions. Now, for some reason in 2020, flu disappeared. And there was a commensurate increase in the amount of coronavirus cases. Now, part of that was due to hospital infections. Part of that was due to the bad handling of test data. But part of that was just the parking of unidentified respiratory conditions, which before we would put under the flu banner, very conveniently put under the coronavirus banner. And so for some reason in that year, despite every other year having a similar level of flu cases, there were almost zero flu cases admitted into hospitals. In fact, they were all bracketed under coronavirus, which of course then makes that yet more deadly. Because people
perhaps reveals the psychological objectives as well.
Exactly.
Rebranding,
These
marketing.
But has anyone been tested for the flu conclusively?
No, I mean, there was
your
no...
entire life. You know, it's all symptomatic.
I certainly haven't. That's for one. And not that I've ever been tested for anything other than complete madness, which I have been confirmed to be.
As many of us.
We all are.
I do have family who work in the pharmaceutical industry, and a family member who was also one of the first to patent a coronavirus molecule. He's retired now, but that was, I believe, 2005 when this first molecule was patented, and that's part of the worry, isn't it?
Is that are these patents related to the gain of function research, or what was the nature of the patent?
Well, in order to investigate
Yeah.
how a virus will respond. You need to enable to make it more infectious.
Mm.
That's what gain of function simply means. These are protein channels that are on the membrane of the cell, and you've got these little hairs, proteins floating around, and along comes a virus and
Yeah.
grabs it, and they can be absorbed through a protein channel into the plasma inside the membrane, where it will interact with the rest of the cell, and it will have certain consequences. And and there's never one single way of reacting. Everybody's different. Some people died, other people didn't, and apparently there was something involved, something to do with your blood type, which defined whether you were more infectious, you were more
Liable
prone
to
to
infection,
Yeah.
liable to have bad
I actually had
consequences.
all of the symptoms of COVID on Christmas Day 2019.
Mm.
Yeah, that was, and it didn't actually click until much later on that this disease, which was the worst infection that I've ever had in my life, I would say. I couldn't walk. My blood felt like it was thick and it was difficult to pump through my entire body. I lost the ability to breathe. It was touch and go at some points where I couldn't even shout for help because I was literally breathing, but nothing was actually happening. I was paralyzed in bed, and I'd taken some melatonin, like 9 milligrams of melatonin, which is quite a lot of melatonin, generally speaking, because usually
Just to
you'd be
make you sleep.
Because I was thinking, hey, I need to get some sleep. I'm really out of it. Let me try and stimulate my system to get to bed. So I'd taken some melatonin, took some paracetamol, ibuprofen. I took the whole cocktail of whatever was immediately available to me. And it turns out that the melatonin was a lifesaver. Because
Really?
yes, turns out melatonin is part of the FLCCC COVID frontline, care part of the care plan.
Well,
They
yeah, because
include
they have
melatonin inside it.
inserted a lot of new ones, haven't they, as time has gone by?
Melatonin turns out to be really good. And I was thinking to myself, this was a number of months afterwards that I realized, hang on a minute, I've actually had this infection already. I just didn't, because while I was sick, I was watching Wuhan, all the videos of them spraying the streets with these dump trucks full of liquid. They were aerosolizing whatever. We don't know what it was. We think it was bleach, maybe. We don't know what it was. And I was watching those videos, and I'd never added 2 and 2 together to think, hang on a minute, I've already got this, and then we later on found out there was some biopsies taken in Italy of cancer patients of the lung. And turns out those cancer patients, I think it was way back in September of 2019, they were testing positive for SARS-CoV-2.
Right.
And I was like, so okay, this has been out for a very long time. This isn't just something that's just leaked.
Yes.
This is something that, look, tinfoil hats on, guys. Perhaps it's been leaked a long time ago, or it's just sneaked out and it's been ignored and thinking, hey, guys, it will go away. That's what humans like to assume, that everything's going to be fine. And then it's catastrophic failure. And then we start patching things together and thinking, let's deal with this. And then, so later on, let me just add a few more things to this medicine that worked. I was thinking, why is my mother still around? Because she's got a lot of health complications, right? And I was thinking, how did she make it out? Because I got it really bad. I was touch and go. And then I had a look at her medications, and it turns out, and I was Googling them to be like COVID-19, and put the drugs beside it. And then 2 of the drugs that she was taking for arthritis, one of them was statins. Turns out they're really good for fighting COVID, because the Chinese have already done the research on them. So I was like, and then this leads us down the path of all of the medications that are already legally available and need to be off-license medicines that are available to treat COVID. Because remember, no one receives any treatment for COVID right now. Even now, there's no real treatment for it. There's only an alleged vaccine, and how long do we actually have protection? Like even
I think Bill Gates wants to get it down to 45
Yes.
minutes. And then you need another shot.
Yeah.
Essentially,
Yes.
no, I mean, it's a joke, but nevertheless, the modeling of the pharmaceutical industry is on diabetics.
Mm.
What we could see with this increase in the medicalizing of healthy people with a homeostasis in their body, they're not suffering from an infection, but they wish to prevent such infection with more and more intervention, is we can see a model of seeking homeostasis. So the consciousness, the psychological consciousness that we're being inculcated into, is this idea that we're not inherently healthy. We don't have a homeostatic body.
Of course, yeah.
We have to seek the high of health, and so we have to bolster our immune system with inoculations of who knows what exactly. I mean, you know, the pharma companies have said in the Senate that the mRNA vaccines are a digital platform for future implementation of the human genome as an operating system. So they are trying to decode and recode your recombinant DNA as software. So now we see an operating system built by Bill Gates, funnily enough, who is so good at antivirus with his Windows platform.
Is it susceptible to viruses?
That he's now decided to take on the challenge of the human genome as an operating system. So the other testimony in the Senate that came out in the past few months was that if anybody did a nasal penetrating test that you send away for coronavirus, they helpfully 23andMe'd you. They gene coded you. So now that the genetic code that was located inside the cells of your own body is now on a pharmaceutical government database shared with government. It seems that from the understanding of some of the bioweapons labs research that was going on in the Ukraine, that one of their tests was to ask the public to be paid to join a study, and the study was the parameter of the study was, we're going to give you something. Do you have Russian heritage, Jewish heritage, German heritage, Ukrainian heritage? What combination of heritage do you have? In somewhere like Odessa is a very mixed community of port cities along the Black Sea coast have always been the location of huge amounts of migration, and so they have very mixed polities, and some communities where there are bloodlines that remain unique to that community. So in Ukraine, they were looking for studies based on ethnicity, so to try to isolate a medicine or biological agent, let's say, which targets some ethnicities and not others.
And not others, yes.
Now, if you take this back, okay, so the UN and the WF and the
Klaus's
WHO
dodgy accent
have already suggested that a new form of humanitarian humane warfare is the targeting of bioweapons to specific people. So instead of killing your Al-Qaeda general with a drone, you can kill him with a genetic agent, which only affects him and his bloodline. So here we are. We're having another story of tech deployment and narrative control being built up. Now, where does that take us? So,
first, Laurenzo, I think that you've just said something that's really important that we should quickly stop to, because if you observe at what's going on at every level, that sort of kill switch manipulation is ongoing. They're putting kill switches into cars now. Smart meters. What's a smart meter for? At the end of the day. Smart meter
remotely turning off your
gas, your electricity. What's an electric car for?
Today, if you saw in the news only today, the government have rolled out a program where of electricity and gas bill forgiveness for proving in your smart meter that you've turned off your appliances for a certain number of hours a day. Now we're being incentivized onto the smart grid by a series of carrots and sticks to allow ourselves to be networked with the Internet of Things, to allow, as you say, these devices to control themselves, be networked, and allow those kill switches to be used at the will of some power, which is not the people.
Well, they did disable some car chargers in the States through these IoT, smart meters.
Yeah.
They disabled the car chargers.
Oh, yes, I heard about this.
They disabled
Yes.
the car chargers and said, sorry, unfortunately,
Community rules.
because
You've offended
our
the community
system was
rules.
never intended to charge smart cars in the first place, and we've got an energy crisis. Well, you can't charge anything.
No
You're just
car
like,
for
there is
30 days.
Yeah, there's like, hey, you're just not going to be charging anything. So yeah, Japan has actually, sorry to digress.
No, go ahead.
Japan has actually said, we're not going down the avenue of electric cars. They're going down the route of hydrogen and possibly methanol engines.
Yeah.
So they've definitely chose a different route.
Mhm.
And there's something that, in terms of energy, people do need to, I know I said all the time, people need to wake up, but people need to celebrate our engineers a little bit more, because we don't seem to live in the culture of the Industrial Revolution was born here
Yes.
in the United Kingdom.
So interestingly, here's a point for you in terms of the rollout of tech in different fields. So the problem with electric cars is they don't have removable batteries. The problem with smartphones is that they do not have removable batteries. Here is a tech rollout, a general schema that we can see across different industry verticals of non-removable batteries. Now, in a serious business meeting back in the 90s, you would have your mobile phone. You would take the battery out, you would take the SIM card out, you would pile them inverted on the table as a sign that you're not monitoring what's going on at this table. Now, of course, because of planned obsolescence, that's what we're told we're told the rollout idea is, in terms of green thinking. These batteries in these smartphones have become non-removable. Now, the problem here is that the problem here is we perceive is, oh, there's planned obsolescence, the batteries don't last. Of course, the kill switch that we have only turns off the screen of the phone. It doesn't shut down the modem in the phone. It doesn't shut down its ability to broadcast its location, as we've found with various studies on Google, or the data feed, the audio
data
feed,
collection.
and video feed. So we are being now we're being now put into a matrix where we pay for the privilege of the device that's
surveilled.
So we can see this in the phone. The reason the batteries don't work, of course, is because they're sending so much data out when we have them off or on standby. And in the electric car, you could easily in your Tesla have a series of slots for the batteries in the base. Correct. Where you could remove that battery cell pack and replace it with one from your charging station. Now, of course, that modular design has not been implemented in the same way that it's been de-implemented in mobile phones, as we've had this globalist tech rollout, as you were saying. We can see how these different industries are actually aligning on different modes of command and control. If you had removable batteries in your electric car, or a hybrid petrol hydrogen electric vehicle, where you had in times of energy crisis, where you had a diversity of different powering mechanisms, then you could get an anti-fragile vehicle and transport. But of course, they don't want.
Here's the thing with removable batteries, we're still not fixing the infrastructure problem, because removable or not, we still have to charge the batteries, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Even if there's 10 million, it doesn't matter if they're removable or not removable. We have to charge those batteries. So even if they are removable, we still don't have the infrastructure to charge them, the energy to charge them.
Yes.
You see? I just want to touch on something that is related to this that no one talks about. I recently went to a TEDx, and it was this guy called Richard Pearson. So I'm going to plug Richard Pearson right now. And his company is Tokyo Fusioneering. And I think it's remarkable what he's working on. And have you heard of a fusion reactor before?
Yes.
You might have seen like the classical plasma going around.
Yeah.
We're trying to create a sun on Earth, right? Everyone's kind of seen something related to this. So the plasma comes from a gyrotron. That's what it's called. That's
Yeah.
where the plasma
As in
arrives
the
from.
CERN is one such example. right?
That's a different. That's slightly different. Yeah, it's slightly different. I'm talking about fusion reactors. We're literally trying to create the sun on Earth.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
with
yeah.
a toroidal,
Yes.
with a toroidal engine.
Yeah. So if you Google it, you'll see. There'll be a toroidal shape, and the plasma's going on. It's glowing,
Let's find an illustration.
and yeah. So what's creating that plasma is called a gyrotron. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this in relation to cars and all of this stuff is because I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm obsessed with the mechanical world and understanding energy. If you've seen a £50 note, it says here's what all man seeks. And, Bolton and James Watt are on there. And he says unlimited power.
Oliver.
Yeah.
So,
Screen.
oh, have you got
There
it?
we go. Here we go. So here's an illustration.
Yeah, this is the
of
illustration
the
of a fusion
toroidal
reactor.
Fusion reactor.
And if we can also pull up, there we go, the top one, the third one along.
Yes.
If you can click the
Here,
third,
this
the next one, next one,
this
one. So this right here is the actual live fusion energy. Like we're trying to raise its energy level. You can see the plasma. Plasma is the fourth state of matter, and so all that plasma
Actually gives off
fission is
less, right?
splitting.
It's
We're
splitting
splitting
atoms.
atoms.
One
Yes.
nucleus.
Yeah, fusion is the way the sun works.
Stick
It's
them together.
literally we're fusing atoms. So when I won't go into all the specific details, but when atoms fuse together, there's always a spare electron that goes out, and you're like, oh, that spare one flies out. It's no longer needed in that stable structure. So that's where, with fusion, we get energy. And the more you keep fusing, there's always a spare.
remainder.
Yeah, there's a remainder. And you're like, oh, we don't need that anymore. But the act of fusion is a very high energy process.
Yeah, much more than fission.
And this dream, it would be a beautiful, romantic dream come true if we get to this stage. Amazing. I really hope that we get there. I really do. Now, you can search gyrotron. We can pull up what a gyrotron is. So a gyrotron is the device which, so the second one, go down, right, the orange one. Yeah, that will do. Yeah, that will do.
Okay, fantastic.
So if we can even zoom into it or something, that'll be fine.
Absolutely.
So this is the device which basically creates all of the fusion energy. That'll be fine. They can see it from here.
Yeah.
So a gyrotron, normal drilling, the reason I'm mentioning this is because there's infinite energy, right? Well, I call it infinite, right between underground. We've got as much energy as you possibly need.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So even
Core, you mean?
yes, you don't have to go to the core. I mean, the core's allegedly made of crystals that are beyond our imagination of how exactly it's forming. But if we can get access to 10 to 20 miles deep, we arrive at this stage of superheated rock, which is 650 to 700 degrees. This is an amazing temperature because when you inject water into this, it flashes to steam. There's no phase change in that way that we think of, water boiling. It's literally
the geysers.
Yeah. Yes.
Geysers are one such
it's so
example.
powerful. So the difference is with this gyrotron, it acts as a drill. If you put it into the ground and you run 30 to 60 megawatts, it blasts through rocks and vaporizes it.
Yeah.
In contrast to the way we drill right now, 80% of the time, you're just changing the drill bit.
Yes.
And the closer you go underground, the more often you got to change the drill bit. So as you can imagine, the curve gets exponential. You're like, there's no point doing this because the cost becomes infinite very fast.
You'll never
get it
there
unless you arrive at these specific veins of magma that travel closer to the surface, and this is.
But you will learn what a differential equation is.
Yes,
right?
So
10 to 0.
Yeah, this is it. So the difference with this, the gyrotron, is the drill bit, which is the plasma. It never needs changing because it's continuously operating, and there's no need to evacuate any rocks because it vaporizes the rocks. And just think of it as there's a giant tunnel shaft, and there's just a powerful wind going up the shaft from the vaporization. So 60 megawatts is quite low energy. We can create a lot more than 60 megawatts with this technology. That's just like on a baby scale.
So
Just
it's a highly armored drill bit, so that so it
Yes.
can withstand the vaporized.
Yeah, it will be able to
But does it
material
physically
coming
go
past
into
it.
the earth?
Yes,
or
you lower it in.
you're lowering it
So the
in?
difference between drilling is you'd be drilling, change the bit. Only 20% of the
Yeah,
time you're
yeah,
cutting the rock.
Yeah.
And with this one, there's no changing of anything. Just you can remotely sense everything's okay. That's it. There's a continuous movement of like 10 centimeters per hour, and it goes
Wow.
and it goes and it goes. The difference being you can reach superheated rock with this potentially in 100 days. That's it.
Oh, wow.
In 100
Are they
days.
operational?
Your own power plant in 100 days.
Are they
So
operational?
once we get this, so there used to be just a handful of companies creating gyrotrons and going down this path of like, fusion energy. But now the fusion energy sector's kind of split. And now we've got to this stage where it's like the people making the gyrotrons are like, oh, there's another use for this, which is also to do with energy liberation.
Yes.
But it's not creating fusion reactors.
So you've
It's
got
going after the geothermal energy.
So you've got this is a potential for your private geothermal power plant on non-Iceland.
To give you
territory.
numbers, the cost would be around about 500,000 to $1 million to reach that, which is
so
almost nothing.
So is there any analysis of that level? Let's say there were a marketplace built up for private geothermal power plants away from fault lines in tectonic plates like Iceland, where there's a lot of geothermal energy.
Well,
harvested,
98%.
like Chile.
Yeah.
So, do we have any data?
It would be easier in Chile. Yeah.
Do we have any data on the perforation level of the crust? So, if let's say there were lots of these plants, and let's say that they went down to a per district level for district heating, or even a per building level. I don't know how far would that market have to penetrate before we'd have a problem with. Oh, could we destabilize the crust here?
I don't think there will be any destabilization.
No, absolutely no.
Because the holes that you're drilling are really not that big. And the beautiful thing is when you use plasma to drill these holes, you're melting rock to an almost glass obsidian. Have you seen obsidian before? It's a really hard black glass, and when you melt granite, you create this rock solid obsidian.
It's flint.
Yeah,
right?
it's a solid, hard, really solid rock. So when the plasma is cutting down, a beautiful side effect of it is it makes its own glass-like walls.
Yes.
So it's already reinforcing itself. See, everything just adds up. And it's not something I have to convince you. It just clicks. You just get it. You're like, oh, of course it does, because you're melting rock, then it cools down, and then it solidifies into this glass-like wall. Normally, we'd have to put down sleeves. You get it?
Yes.
You put down sleeves
to make it slip as well.
Yeah, that's it. You got to put down sleeves, reinforce it, make sure there's no. But you're like, oh, with this one, it makes its own sleeves, and you just lower it and lower it and lower it. So, I think 1% of the geothermal energy of Earth, if we used 1%, would last us humans 2 million years. 1%
at our current level of population.
And obviously, you're going to ask me, Laurenzo, what's going to happen if we use? There's always a side effect.
Yes,
we're just going to reduce. We're going to slow down the rate of the rate at which the Earth turns. That's the side effect.
And the magnetic pole.
I don't think we'll do anything with the pole shifts. That's like we're not going to be able to touch all of that soon, because we have to really start extracting. But the side effect is, on a minute scale, will slow down the rate at which the Earth turns. That's the long term.
Small hole in the crust.
Yeah, I'm talking about. We're talking about. Remember, 1% is 2 million years. So by the next 500,000 years, we've probably created technology that's way beyond all of this.
Yeah. So below our feet, there seems to be a limitless source of energy in the heat that we find.
Everything that you could dream.
Now,
and above our heads too.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, what do we think is the reason why this industry hasn't taken off thus far? Before we do, what was the relationship between the fusion reactor and the plasma? There was one industry that's producing plasma that's mainly focused on, to be clear, the fusion reactor, to supplying the fusion reactor experiment business. But now they found a second use.
Well, that's the
in
fusion
energy
drilling.
for fusion drilling.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we've got to the point where
Is that the bottleneck?
gyrotrons are being developed to such high standards. It's like the iPhone. Like, this is now when the first iPhone came out, Hollywood was not thinking, we're going to have competition against, not Hollywood, Canon and Sony and the camera makers. I can see you got some Black Magics over here, which didn't exist, I would say, like 10, 15 years ago. I'm not in that industry.
No, they didn't.
But, now you can film an entire movie with this iPhone 14.
Yes, you can.
Because, I was just listening to a podcast today on Joe Rogan. He had this, the foodie on Sonny from the best, the food channel. And he was like, when we were in Egypt, they took our cameras away. Yeah. And he goes, because over there, they're really funny about cameras, and they found walkie-talkies, and they were like, oh, we don't allow walkie-talkies because of the revolution.
Yes.
And the government can shut down phones, but they can't shut down walkie-talkies.
Yes.
So that we don't allow them here anymore.
That's a layer.
So they took all their cameras away just out of caution, but they left them with the phones, and they filmed the entire episode with the phones, and the audience, the viewers never even flinched. They were like, it's great, no problem. So
it passed the test of it being good enough.
So the same way, these gyrotrons used to be, gold dust. Like, oh wow, these are really expensive, and it requires sophisticated technology. And it was only really until I started researching into geothermal to think, why do we not take it seriously? And then I realized, oh, we are actually taking it seriously. And then I spoke to a friend who said, hey, I'm doing events on, I'm organizing an event on decentralization of energy. And then just so happens I spoke to a guy in the oil and gas industry, and I used to despise the oil and gas industry until I got red-pilled, and then I realized these guys are our saviors. They've got all of the technology, the know-how, the implementation strategies to find the low-hanging fruit first. Do you see where those fissures of like high temperatures are? They're actually not our enemy, but we're living in a world right now where people are really trying to capitalize on who owns the patents and the tech for all of this. If it's not being spoken about, it's usually because it's being suppressed. Do you see? It's usually because it's being suppressed.
Well, precisely that leads me on to the question of why, if this technology is so convenient, why are we not already using it? And of course, I've already had 1,000 conversations about why would the oil and gas industry give up the market that it already has? And in the same way as the article by Richard J. Roberts in 1993 about the pharmaceutical industry, where this Nobel Prize for Medicine says, when big pharma see a cure, they'll immediately divert away from it because what they want are lifelong treatments. Which
exactly
are.
Can you pull up a video on fusion drilling just so people can have a little, if it works,
It seems to run right across the. See, the problem here seems to be centered with the monetary and the nature of the industry itself.
Yeah. And also, let's hypothetically, let's assume that it's already industrialized, this technology. The whole world works on fusion, geothermal fusion drilling. Okay, great.
Okay.
Still, having batteries for cars does not make sense. Why? Because you have to upgrade the entire infrastructure. Charging batteries is slow. You got to do this. Why not just use all that free energy to create hydrogen?
Yes.
Do you see where I'm going? You've got free energy now. You can play with whatever you want. You can make hydrogen. You can start creating methane. You can use all kinds of different technologies to create different exotic fuels that usually require a very rare energy. Is hard to get. It's in limited quantities usually. Yeah. But if we have infinite energy accessible to us for very cheap, we're entering a stage where energy is almost about. We're about. It's not going to go up in price. This is just. I see it as this is the last stage where energy is going to be worth a lot of money, because once it.
Peak oil.
Yes.
So peak oil was a story around 2005, 2006, as I recall,
I
in
remember
terms of the propaganda narrative, was due to market forces. When the commodities markets come to know that we've mined more than 50% of the total hydrocarbon yield of coal, gas, oil on the planet, then we'll see a sudden exponential curve because of this great civilizational depression that we'll know the party's coming to an end, and suddenly we'll know that we've elapsed exactly 50% of the total potential for civilization ever existing on this planet, that suddenly the markets will flip, the bond yield curve will flip, and there'll be an exponential increase in the price of oil, gas, and coal, all hydrocarbon power, until our civilization tears itself apart with the centripetal forces of market dynamics, because we're depressed. And this is peak oil. We know now just we're on the cusp. We're at 49%. We must imagine 50% and imagine the great collapse of our civilization in 5 years' time. It's always 5 or 10 years' time.
Nostradamus gave us a bit. Nostradamus gave us a bit more
when
time.
we
Come on.
reach peak oil, and then within that 5 years span, by 2010 or so, peak oil had disappeared off the radar because the narrative had not taken into account the idea of, well, if the price of oil increases, then more of that money can be reinvested in discovery, because you've got your margin. So your nice oil company that you were discussing before will have the opportunity and incentive to reinvest some of its massive profits from the increasing price of oil into increased discovery, which is how shale and shale oil and shale gas and fracking were discovered, because increasing yield led to of profit led to more reinvestment in a bendy straw looking around the oil well for the harder to reach deposits, because there was a decreasing supply and more incentivization from this market commodities to do more discovery. So at that point we had this narrative of peak oil, then we had a narrative of fracking, and both were crises. We go from manufactured crisis to manufactured crisis.
There's no shortage of oil on the earth. Like we're exhausting some of our wells for sure, but Canada alone's got loads of oil. They've got enough oil to supply all of Europe. But what they do is they go and do well testing and evaluations, and then they cap the wells off, and they write it down. This is what we've got, and we're just like, oh, it's done. We're keeping that document of who's got what does not release to anybody. That's like military guarded. Those are like state secrets of how much oil reserves, because that determines your power in the future, your bargaining power. The whole oil pipeline being exploded and destroyed. Well, what was that about? That was to get the market to move.
It was Putin who took snorkeling classes, apparently.
US hegemony of European energy.
Exactly.
Yes, of course.
Exactly.
Of course
This is it.
Yeah.
So we live in a world now. People are seeing it. I still meet people that have no idea about all of this, but it's shocking how many people just added everything together and be like, it's so obvious.
It is pretty obvious.
It's so obvious.
You don't need to be a genius to just take one look.
It's just common sense. They say common sense was really not that common, but it is still fairly common. You can figure all this stuff out.
But through the internet, you also get a sense of just how many people are very naive.
Yeah. Thankfully, my social media streams, I don't really have too many of those people.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have experience because of the siloing in social media, you might think there's a lot more people who are understanding your way of thinking than there actually are in the public sphere. And so that's why you need to get out of the social media platform silos and actually into the public sphere and really try and engage with people.
Yeah.
Now that's going to be a long task, and one which we have to take on because otherwise this will be a fringe set of views. We will be siloed into fringe social media platforms, which then have there's a market for that, but we need to break out of that marketization. So on that note, we've been trying to put together live, in-person, and online think tanks, which we will be discussing more later on, and we will be advertising how to get involved with that further in the coming weeks and months, both in London, live with live debates, and online. With a further podcast sequence of fascinating speakers like we've had tonight, Pablo Nascimento of Editorial Nascimento Publishing House, who is producing this series of Renascimento smart cities debates with us at the New Athens. We've had Mehul,
Yep.
discussing plasma bit drilling, gyrotron drilling, and the potential for geothermal energy. We've had Philip Fiersov, sculptor, on discussing education platforms and the economy of art and technology, and its potential for incentivizing us to do more learning and share more of our understanding. Here is one of his instant portraits that we can see now.
Sorry, what's her name?
We don't yet know.
We don't know her name.
Nameless.
I don't know.
Carmela.
Yeah, Aphrodite.
Aphrodite. Okay. Aphrodite. I'm sorry, darling. You're going right there for now.
So that is the New Athens season 2, episode 1. So that's episode 38. I'd like to encourage all of you to share this with anybody who might be interested in our movement for human empowerment, education, and freedom in all vectors of technology and society. And we'll be discussing this more on the WhatsApp forum, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. We'll be back on Thursday with another podcast with more special guests, which will be announced tomorrow. Ongoing, there's a whole series of in-person events which we'll be programming and we'll be informing you more about. And then we have a set of projects in technology that we'll be announcing further during the year. I'd like to thank everybody for turning up and for contributing to such a lively debate. It's really fascinating. That we're going to bracket each of these. We'll send out clips, and then let's get together. Panels to talk about each of these topics in more detail as the series goes on. I think we've made a really good start to the 2023 term, and thank you so much for coming. This has been the New Athens live podcast, and it was episode 38, Renascimento. Please share and join us on all the subscriptions that we've shown you. Thank you so much, and have a very good evening. Ciao.
See ya.
Goodbye, without